We have joining us from Seattle, Washington, investigative reporter Scheff to talk to us about this awful story. Liam, good morning.
Good morning, Liz.
And you're coming to us from Seattle, so it's really good early morning.
Your show is, I believe it's called The Wake Up Call.
That is correct.
That's what it is.
That's exactly right. That's why we're calling you in Seattle to have you on the show this morning.
Yeah.
Liam, as I was preparing for this story, and I must say that my intern Emily Skates has been on this from the very beginning, and every time that she would come into my office to tell me something else about what she had found, this is a huge story that involves a whole lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily think would be attached to this story.
The story is complicated. It involves our perceptions of the medical establishment, of how we think about the disease called AIDS, how we think about HIV testing, how we think about pharmaceutical companies. And I think for me, it was a real revelation. I mean, I understood there were problems in the country. I've lived in a lot of cities. I understood that racism is real and exists, and is more or less instituted economically in cities. I didn't understand the extent to which, and I'll explain what I mean, but in a sense, racial profiling plays a role in interpreting disease, and I'll be glad to explain what I mean, but maybe I should just launch into the...
Well, why don't we start with the house that AIDS built?
Okay. My name's Liam Scheff. I'm an independent journalist. In 2003, I was working on a little paper in Boston, and I had a great editor there, and he let me do a series, and the series was called the AIDS Debate, the most controversial story you've never heard. And the reason I decided to do this series was I became aware in the medical literature that the word on AIDS was very different than the word on AIDS in the public perception, the advertisements, and that AIDS in the medical literature looked like a complicated, multifactorial illness. Now, I'm going to talk about AIDS today from what I'll call the non-religious point of view. There are people who sort of worship at this medical altar and don't allow any discussion or dispute. That's not me. So there are people who are going to be a little upset or challenged or whatever by what I say. Well, hold on to your hats and get a pen and start taking notes, and you can do the research and see if it's correct. The non-religious point of view of AIDS says that it's this multifactorial thing that, the religious view says it has one cause, it's a sexually transmitted virus. The problem is nobody knows how, really, or if this thing is sexually transmitted. There's very little evidence, good evidence, for strong sexual transmission in the medical literature. What you have instead are people all over the world getting sick with a variety of illnesses that are now said to be immune suppressed, that they have acquired immune deficiency. In the early 80s, there was a group of men in the gay community who were late 70s really, were using a lot of drugs, a lot of recreational drugs, having a lot of sex, had a lot of STDs, and they got sick for what appears to be a variety of reasons, not the least of which would be drug toxicity and toxicology. Over-intoxication over periods of years. This is another, by the way, the gay community is another community that's pushed to the outside and not treated as well as the standard white community in this culture. In that community, guys were getting sick. They went into the hospitals. They were given very toxic drugs, chemotherapies, etc. A lot of them died. The first idea was in what was called GRID, or gay-related immune disease, was that they had, in a sense, long-term drug poisoning from a variety of things, coupled with other lifestyle factors. But there were some doctors who were working in virology, and they wanted to say that it was a single-cause illness. It didn't make any sense to say it was a single-cause illness because the guys who were getting sick had a lot of things going on.
But this is a political story as well.
It's a political story.
Because it's easier politically to make it one cause as opposed to a bunch of different causes.
Right. And I realize this is controversial for people. I don't You don't have to accept it as gospel. You can look it up. It's in a variety of medical publications. The story has been told over and over again. But the political definition that acquired immune deficiency, as experienced in this early gay population, had one single cause, which we now call HIV. Now, you can look in the body. You can always find viruses. You can always find little bits and pieces of things. Does it cause it? Does it not? I'll leave that to the researchers. What you do find is that in places like Africa, the definition has to be rewritten. So the population of people here in the United States and Europe who were getting sick in that way were 100% drug abusers and gay men. Then the CDC expanded the definition and they included hemophiliacs. Now, they just expanded the definition, then they expanded it again. Now, this was a legal thing, not a biologic thing. They just said we're going to include more symptoms and more people in this definition, this growing definition. Africa got thrown into the definition in 1985. The definition of AIDS in Africa was always clinical. It never had anything to do with virology or anything related to what was happening in the gay men. I realize this is a controversial foot to start in, but this is how I got into this story, and I'll end it just about here. In Africa, the definition of AIDS was called the Bangui definition after the capital of the Central African Republic, called Bangui, because the World Health Organization, presided over by members of our CDC, that's our Centers for Disease Control, a guy called Joseph McCormick, it's in his biography, Virus Hunters of the CDC, said that AIDS in Africa would always be defined by clinical symptoms like diarrhea, fever, weight loss of up to 10% of your body weight over a period of a month or so. Well, when I was a kid, I went to, I was in Southern Europe. I was in Greece, and I drank water out of a tap, and I lost about 10% of my body weight in the next couple of days. I had fever, diarrhea, I was delirious. By any standard World Health Organization definition, I had clinical AIDS. Of course, what I had was water poisoning. And in Africa, what you have in sub-Saharan Africa is 50-60% of the population, by reasonable estimates of the population, that does not have clean water. They don't have sewage reclamation. 50 to 60% of the rural population drinks water that they share with other human populations, animal runoff, human waste, trash. Any good epidemiologist in Africa will tell you that it's impossible to separate what we call AIDS from absolute destitute poverty. So I wrote a series called the AIDS Debate, and it was a 3-part series. It got a lot of press. Then, because I was writing about AIDS, again, from this critical point of view, what are we calling AIDS? How are we treating it? I was contacted by a woman in New York, and the woman had 2 kids. She's their aunt. She adopted them. Their mother, their natural mother, was a drug user in New York City when a lot of people ended up using crack in New York and other cities. Now, there might be some political intrigue to that story that you might be aware about. Some people have covered how cheap cocaine got into cities.
Of course, I've had Maxine Waters on the show to talk about that.
And, there's something to that that's worth talking about. There were a lot of babies born to moms who were using crack in the 80s. And this became something of a mini epidemic. This place in New York City and near Harlem called Incarnation Children's Center was established by some nuns, the Catholic Church, to take in these border babies, these babies abandoned at the hospital. And they were doing, I think, rather noble work. And they were taking in the kids and caring for them. And these kids were, dropped on hospital doorsteps by moms who just couldn't, bear to sort of face the day, having a lot of trouble. The nuns cared for them and took care for them, and according to Incarnation Children's Center's history, nursed a lot of them back to health with proper nurturing and basic medical care. Well, the doctors who ran and who got involved with Incarnation Children's Center are from Columbia Presbyterian, Columbia University. And they decided that this orphan population was a good population to test new drugs on. I didn't misspeak. They decided that this orphan population was just the right population to test new and various drugs on. And in 1992, according to ICC's own printed history, with funding from the National Institutes of Health, that's our government.
So they got money from our good government to begin. That's us. Doctors, medical doctors who take the Hippocratic oath that thou shalt do no harm, thought of the idea of testing babies, infants, orphan infants, and our government said, bet, let me give you some money for that.
Absolutely. And the money came in, and ICC became a recipient of a lot of funds. Were
the nuns still involved?
The nuns were there to oversee sort of daily caretaking activities, and my word from my sources, I think we're going to have one of my sources on later, is that the nuns were very loving and very caring. Now, they were excised from the place in the late 90s totally, but in the early 90s they were still there. The guy who runs the place, or ran it, and established what ICC became is Dr. Stephen Nicholas. And Stephen Nicholas is considered one of the, one of the most vaunted doctors, the doctors with the most awards, with people just singing his praises. Why? Because he worked with these poor babies. Well, what he did was he allowed this population to be used in clinical trials. All right. Now, good papers like the New York Times like to defend what happened there by saying that these children were given the best medical care, and otherwise they would have died. Now, there's a problem in AIDS theory, and the problem is the major contention of AIDS theory, and that is that if you test HIV positive, you have the disease that gay men in the early 80s got, and you're going to die. Now, we know that that's not true clinically. We know that...
Why do we know that?
We know that what happened in the early 80s was, at least with any kind of clear-headed analytic review of the medical literature, was specific to a time and place. We know that what we call AIDS in Africa is totally dependent on toxicology, clinical symptoms, poverty. The other reason that we know testing HIV positive doesn't mean that you're going to get either of these kind of historically instituted or specific diseases is that HIV tests don't test for any particular virus. Now, to add controversy to controversy, I'm just going to get all the way into it.
Yeah, you are.
HIV tests don't test for viruses. Now, anybody who says otherwise is really itching for a good fight because it says inside of the HIV test, and this is in all of my reporting, this test should not be used as a clinical test or a diagnostic test for HIV. And the reason that these tests warn that they're not supposed to be used is that they don't test for a virus. They test for antibodies. They test for proteins, or they test for little slivers of genetic material, which are sort of copied out of your own white blood cell. Now, that's different than saying that they go into the body and find a virus. They don't. If you have dysentery, if you have tuberculosis, malaria, herpes, alcoholic liver disease, if you have a damaged liver, if you're pregnant. Let me say that again. If you're pregnant, this is one of the things that it says inside of HIV tests that can make these protein tests, these reactions, come up reactive. If you're the child of a drug user and you have a lot of antibodies in your blood, or you're having one of these tests enforced on you, it's not difficult to have a reactive test.
But that doesn't mean that you're HIV positive.
It simply does not mean that you're HIV positive. The other problem with HIV testing is that it has to go through what's called a risk group analysis. If you're not in a risk group, you're not very likely to be tested. This is sort of the end of the controversial part of the talk. But if you're not in a risk group, and this is what it says in the medical literature, I sent you some examples that were published. They're
right, and they're up on the website at LizzBrown.com.
Right. So, you get citations like this from the standard literature. This is a short quote, and they're talking about the error rate. Now, nobody hears about this. I'm talking about the error rate in HIV tests. This is from 1998 when the new tests, the rapid tests, were first being marketed. This is a quote from a journal called AIDS Alert. And they say the error rate won't which they consider high, won't matter much in areas with a high prevalence of HIV because in all probability the people testing false positive will have the disease.
So they're talking about if we're testing people that are in the high-risk group, doesn't matter that there's a lousy error rate because they're probably going to have it anyway.
Right. What does that mean? It means that they're going to have symptoms that we consider to be what we now call AIDS, acquired immune deficiency. What are the symptoms? A cough, a fever, a chronically suppressed immune system. Anybody living in poverty has that. Any drug user has that. Anybody living in rural Africa has any of those symptoms at any time.
Okay,
the end of that quote is,
okay, go ahead.
And then we'll get right back into ICC. But if the same test was performed on, I couldn't believe this when I read this, but if the same test was performed on 1,000 white, affluent suburban housewives, a low prevalence population, in all likelihood, all positive results will be false, and positive predictive values plummet to zero. These tests are totally dependent on the group that you're testing, not the test itself. It's not an accurate test. It's a test for sort of perception about whether this group has a disease that we think that people in the early 80s had, blah, 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 blah. These tests are not testing for a virus. That's what they're not testing for.
And we're going to take a break here. I'm talking to Liam Scheff, independent investigative reporter. He's joining us from Seattle, Washington. We're talking about an article he wrote, The House That AIDS Built. We're talking about experimentation on orphans. We're talking about AIDS. We're talking about racism. We're talking about America. We're talking about experimentation by doctors funded by our government on orphans to test them for AIDS. My guest this morning, joining us from Seattle, Washington, is Liam Scheff. He is the investigative reporter that broke this story. Liam, welcome back. Liam.
Let's jump right back in. Incarnation Children's Center is this orphanage in Washington Heights, just north of Harlem. And this was established in the 90s to take care of these abandoned border babies. That's what we were talking about in the first half hour. In 92, the NIH decided that this population was going to be as good as any to test drugs on.
Aren't there rules against testing on children?
Yes, there are.
Aren't there the FCC? I mean, not the FCC, but the...
There are NIH rules against, National Institute of Health rules against using wards of the state in clinical trials. But...
How did they get around this?
Well, you get around it by appealing to public sympathy. And the reason I started by talking about really what I consider the messy and I think inaccurate definition with this thing that we call AIDS is, if you go with the definition of AIDS that we have, which is a single cause illness with no cure, blah blah blah, caused by one thing, instead of what it appears to be, the multifactorial, complex, treatable illness that occurs around the world because of poverty, drug toxicity, and other things. If you go with the first view, you can do anything you want.
So basically they're saying these babies have a death sentence anyway. It doesn't matter what we do. We can just do anything we need to do.
We're saving their lives. And if you think that I'm making that line up, you ought to read the New York Times more. I investigated this story for 2 years. Now, the deal with Incarnation Children's Center is it started as a nice place, and it became, I think, a very bad place, a place where kids were used in drug trials with drugs like AZT and nevirapine. These are black box label drugs. They've killed adults, pregnant women in standard use. They are drugs that affect your genetic material. AZT stops your cells from replicating. Nevirapine interrupts the normal transfer of genetic information in your cell. The side effects, or the major unwanted effects of the drugs, include liver failure, death, skin death. And when I say skin death from nevirapine, I mean large chunks of your skin die off. And
that's a lot of the pictures that you've included in your article, The House That AIDS Built, showed babies with skin just off of them.
Yeah, there are pictures from a European nevirapine trial in which young trial subjects actually have large chunks of skin coming off. Now, that's not the most common effect, and people will say, well, it only occurs in 6% or 12% or whatever they say. Now, I talked to a rep from Boehringer, the company that makes the drug, Boehringer Ingelheim, and she said that she felt they were underreporting. Let's put it at 10%. Let's say 10% of people who are on nevirapine for a while are going to die because their skin comes off. That's not a cure for AIDS. AZT, let's put it at 2%. That's not a cure for AIDS. We wouldn't accept that for any other illness, but we accept the idea without questioning that AIDS is a that acquired immune deficiency, remember that's what it stands for, immune deficiency, as one cause all over the world if, and I want to be clear, if you're black or you're gay. If you have immune deficiency and you're outside of these groups, you're not in the risk group and you're just not tested. And that is not an exaggeration. That is repeated again and again in the medical literature. Do not test people who are not in risk groups. You'll get false positive results.
So we're using toxic drugs on infants. We're using toxic drugs on children. Toxic drugs that cause genetic mutation, organ failure, bone marrow death, bodily deformations, brain damage, and fatal skin disorders. We're using that on orphans.
We're using that on orphans, and we're saying we're doing them a favor. And the New York Times came out, and after I reported on this story for 2 years, after a BBC movie got made about it, after the Associated Press did a totally unrelated independent investigation without me, without contacting me, they came to their own conclusions that this was happening, that these drugs were very toxic. The New York Times came out and asked the doctor, is anything bad happening? Which doctor? The doctor who set up the program, Dr. Stephen Nicholas, who's not even there anymore. Asked him and him alone. Is AZT a good drug? Yes, he said, it's a great drug.
And then they asked him also the question, has any child died as a result of this? And what was his answer? It was a legal answer. I know as a lawyer, there's a legal answer. He said, not that I'm aware of.
Not that I'm aware of.
He didn't say nobody died. He said, not that I'm aware of.
He was also asked the question, were there any unexpected results from the drug trials with AZT, with nevirapine, at Incarnation Children's Center? No, there were no unexpected results. What's an expected result from AZT? Organ failure, death, deformation, failure to thrive, all of the illnesses that we call AIDS. Now here's the clever thing. Because the definition of AIDS is so flexible, and that's why I started talking, my talk with talking about what AIDS is, because the definition is so flexible, because you can call it just about anything you want. Guess what happens when these kids die? They die of AIDS. Now, they've been taking AZT since they were born. I mean, AZT is a drug that's killed so many adult gay men that, it was considered just the most heinous drug ever to come around. It was an old chemotherapy drug. It was dumped into the gay community from the 60s, the 1960s. It was not an AIDS drug. It was an old cancer chemotherapy drug. It was very, very toxic. It was dumped into the gay population in about 87. AIDS deaths after the introduction of AZT doubled, then quadrupled. They went up about 4 times by 92, 93 from where they were in 87. And AZT was being handed out like Tic Tacs, like Pez, in very high doses. And, there's very few people will sort of defend AZT, except, of course, not in the medical literature, but in the New York Times.
Well, I want to get back to ICC, and I want to get back to the grandmother that contacted you, and I want you to tell her story.
Sorry.
And Liam, we have Mimi Pascual on the line. Talk to us about who Mimi is.
Mimi was a child care worker at Incarnation Children's Center for about 10 years. Mimi cared for the children at ICC. She was also responsible for drugging them. Now, Mimi's not a nurse. She wasn't trained as a nurse. In fact, none of the women in the early experience at Incarnation were nurses who were giving the kids these drugs. Mimi gave the kids the drugs daily, nightly, all through the night.
Okay, let me get Mimi here on the line. Mimi, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm okay. Huh?
I'm outstanding. Mimi, Liam was describing some of your duties as a ICC worker, Incarnate Children's Center worker. Talk to us about what were some of the things that you did with the children with regard to giving them drugs.
In regards to giving them meds, we were responsible for everything, basically. Day-to-day, clothes, food, and meds was part of their, day-to-day. So,
what did you see? How did the children respond to as you call them, the meds that you were giving them?
Some of them didn't want to take it, and some of them, because you were dealing with them so much on a daily basis, like a mother, they would just take it, just to get it over with for you. Mm-hmm. So, every case was different. Every child was different.
Well, the children that talked about that they didn't want to take it, what kind of, were they serious about this? Were they adamant about this? How did they express this to you?
Well, the older ones, when I first started working there, it was just babies, so they really couldn't talk. They would just throw it, spit it right back up. And as they got older, and they started, saying med refusal. When they refused it X amount of time.
Why did they refuse it? What were some of the physical reasons that they were saying, I don't want this?
Some of them, they made them so sick that they couldn't get up and go to school. Or when they were in school, they couldn't function like the regular kids. So they just didn't, they didn't want it for whatever reason. When
they got sick, what kind of symptoms did they display?
Stomach cramping, mostly that, and constant diarrhea. That wouldn't allow them to stay focused in a classroom like a regular child would. Sleepy, a lot of the kids, they were drugged so much that they were just tired. They just couldn't function.
And Mimi, when the children refused to take the drugs, what would happen to them?
You could only refuse X amount of times. After that, you get a tube inserted into a G tube.
A G tube was inserted into the children. Did you insert that, or how did they do?
Oh no, those are surgically put in.
So they were sent to doctors to get tubes that to put into their bellies to take the drugs.
Yeah.
Mimi, when you would watch the children as you were putting these drugs, these medications into them, what did you see the infants? How did you see the infants respond to this?
At first with meds, it's not like the only direct thing you see. Okay, yeah, you'll get a little diarrhea or a little, not a little. You'll get diarrhea or you'll throw up, and that was like for us, it became so regular that it was like, okay, this is normal. And after a while, other kids will react different, and maybe one will break up in a rash. One of my kids came in, and a couple of months later, she came in, she was fine. She had a stroke, and she went blind. And
after being given these meds.
Yes, because supposedly her case was she wasn't aware of her HIV status. So if you wasn't aware, you wasn't taking medicine. You're in there for that.
So Mimi, when did you see as you kept? How long were you there? How long were you at ICC?
Almost 10 years.
Were the kids getting better with the stuff you were putting into them, or were they getting worse?
Like I said, every child is different. I noticed that the kids that had mental issues, they just the medicines really didn't even faze them at all. They wasn't even taking as much medicine. There was other kids that the moment you gave them medicine, their body would just reject it. From whatever it means, throwing up, diarrhea, rashes, stroke, they would just reject it. Every case is different.
Do you feel after now that you're no longer working for ICC, are you?
No, I have a year.
Yeah, okay. After having time to be away from ICC and after having time to look back on what you were doing, do you feel that what you did with what you were told to do with the medications, you think it made the kids better?
No. No.
And
you know what? To live longer, it's one thing, but to live longer in pain and to have all these, complications like I saw the kids having, like, yeah, you're 18, but now you're growing a breast and you're a boy, or, your body's been through so much damage that you look deformed. I don't think that's what the quality of life is.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
The perception there, and this is sort of drummed into everybody's head, is that the drugs will make you live longer. But longer than what? Longer than the perception that you're supposed to die at a certain age. So they'll say that the effects are very, 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 very strong, terrible. As Mimi says, a girl who had never been told that she was positive, therefore never took the drugs and was not sick, came in, and within a few months on these drugs, AZT and others, had a stroke, went blind, and died a few months later. Can't tell me that she lived longer. I don't think Mimi would say that either. But the general perception, and from doctors who want to defend this kind of thing is, yeah, they'll live longer than what? Not than they lived, than they were supposed to live. Who decided? The doctors decided.
And if the prognosis is that you're going to die, I guess any day past that is something that you could argue is proof of your argument.
It's a circular. it's very circular logic, and it only works in favor of the drug companies, not the children.
Yeah, like I was talking to Liam, and I told him, and if you think that they're going to live as long as you guys say you are, why don't you guys make a plan for them to live well?
And did other nurses talk about? Did you all sit down and talk about, or not nurses, but workers? Because you weren't a nurse. Did you all sit down and talk about how the babies were faring under these drugs?
Every day. It was
and
a topic of a conversation, but you just couldn't prove it. And everybody had their own opinions as well. There's some people that believe others have to suffer and others to live. And then you get into arguments about that. Every day was something new.
Did you feel bad, Mimi? Did you ever feel bad putting these medications into these babies?
You know what? At the beginning, you think you're doing them good. Because if it's not you, who else is going to do it, and who's going to care for them like you care for them? And a lot of the girls adopted these children, too. So you get attached to them, and you really think that you're doing a good. And especially with studies, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. It took us X amount of years to really say, wow, look what happened to so-and-so from the day he came in here to where he's at now.
Did you feel bad about that?
Of course.
Okay. We're going to have to take a break. I'm keeping Liam on. Mimi, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the Wake Up Call. My goodness, we are talking about experimentation, AIDS experimentation, a willingness to experiment on orphans, a willingness to experiment on Africans. It's really a revealing story about what is done and who it's done to in the name of medicine. We started this morning talking to an investigative reporter, Liam Scheff. He's joining us from Seattle, Washington, and we're going to take the story from New York, from the United States, to Africa in just a moment, because we are also joined by a Dr. Jonathan Fishbein. He's a former National Institute of Health employee. He's in Maryland. But I want to go back to Liam for 1 second, because I want Liam to add to the story because I'm sure many of you are asking the questions, well, these were orphans. Nobody could speak for them about what was happening to them, if it was good, if it was bad, the experimentation that was taking place at ICC, Incarnation Children's Center. But sometimes these weren't exactly orphans. Liam, welcome back.
Hi, Liz.
Talk to us about the story of the grandmother and her grandbabies and her efforts to get them out of the control of this experimentation.
Absolutely. Mona, she's probably listening today, and I asked her to listen in so she can consider coming on the show. She's the great aunt, actually, of two kids. Her niece was a drug user using crack and some other drugs. The kids were born and immediately put on AZT, this very, very toxic drug. Now, Mona was very close with her niece, the natural mother, and when the niece realized she wasn't going to be able to take care of the kids, she asked Mona to take them in and raise them as her own, which Mona did. Mona's an educated woman. She works in education. She's got her master's degree. She gave the little boy, Sean, in the story, The House That AIDS Built, that's what he's called, this drug that he came with, and the drug was AZT, liquid AZT, or retrovir. And she says, that she gave it to him because that's what the doctor said to do, but she watched him sort of waste and have a lot of trouble moving and have a lot of trouble walking around, and he wasn't developing. He had a tube going up his nose, down his throat, and he lived on Pediasure, which is this sort of fatty, milky, sugary substance that they give to sick people.
Because he couldn't use regular food.
He couldn't keep food down. One of the effects that Mimi Pascual, who just was on the line with us, talked about was that the kids throw up a lot from these drugs. That was something that the doctor who runs ICC, Catherine Painter, told me. Kids throw up a lot, have trouble taking the medication, so they put in tubes. So Sean came with this drug. Mona, who's the guardian, the legal guardian, decided to investigate the drug. she decided to make an informed choice about what she was doing. She looked into AZT. She looked into the effects. She found it was pretty toxic. She decided to slow down the heavy doses. She did, and the boy started to be able to eat a little bit more and to get around a little bit more. She then decided, after doing this, to stop this one drug, AZT. This is a black box label drug. This is a drug with warnings that it can kill you.
And how old was Sean at the time?
3.
Sean was 3.
And he'd been on this drug his whole life. She took him off, and she says it wasn't overnight, but in a few weeks he could do things he couldn't do. He could walk on his own more easily. He could get around the apartment. Within a couple of months, he was able to run and play with other kids. And this is something he'd never been able to do, and she was just ecstatic.
But she made a mistake. She made a mistake, didn't she?
Well, it didn't seem to her that she did. She went to the medical authorities in New York and said, I've got great news. This boy, Sean, is doing really, really well. I've taken him off the AZT. They said, They sent an infectious disease specialist to her apartment. ACS, Administration for Children's Services, knocked on her door. They sent them, all of them, to an infectious disease specialist. They put the boy on the drug called nevirapine.
He was doing better. He was doing 100%, 1,000% better than he was when he was taking the drugs.
According to her, according to him, yes. According to the medical authorities, it didn't matter. He got on nevirapine. He ended up in the ICU twice due to organ failure. What is nevirapine? What can nevirapine or Viramune cause? Organ failure. It says so on the label, top of the label. They put him in ICC to recover. As he was coming off of the nevirapine, she said, okay. A year and a half later, he was still there. Said, we're not giving him back because you, Mona, you have a reputation for not giving the drugs.
But doesn't she have a right as the guardian of Sean not to give him the medicine?
Not if you're dark skinned and you're in New York City, no. Apparently not. You would think so, and you don't see anybody else getting force-fed AZT. You don't see people in Beverly Hills or La Jolla. But in Harlem, if you're a woman, you're raising these kids. These kids are in the system.
She's the guardian of the child. The child is the child still in the custody and care of child welfare or anything like that?
He's absolutely still locked up in the system. He's gone from drug to drug. They no longer, and by the way, they're no longer keeping him because they say he's HIV positive. Now they're keeping him, and they have him on psychiatric drugs. Now, they're keeping him because they say he's got some psychological problems. Well, this kid's been institutionalized his whole life.
Now, how old is he when they start putting him on psychiatric drugs?
He would. The deal in ICC is, according to Mimi and the other child care workers that I spoke with, was that the place changed, and it went from being. She said when the kids were babies, they couldn't complain; they would just throw up. When they became young
able
adults,
to speak.
They started acting out, and they would just sort of throw fits and want to run away. That's when they started, according to Mimi, that's when the place became a psych ward. Thorazine shots became sort of something that happened, and Sean describes what he calls needle time, when you act out and you get held down and you get a Thorazine shot. And
wait a minute, they're holding these children down to put medicine in them.
Well,
you put these drugs in them.
Well, that's the story from the child care workers is, like Mimi said, a lot of the girls there think they're doing God's work, and some children have to die to save others. That's sort of a line that you get from the girls who work there, the women who work there, and by the way, from a lot of the doctors who defend what's going on. They won't put it so boldly, but they more or less say the same thing. A few lives to save many, many millions. Well, it's not true. You're not saving millions with a few lives. You're just retesting what are more or less failed drugs and keeping them in the market. The end of what Mimi said is also true. Kids who refuse for a certain amount of time get a stomach surgery, and this is to enforce what they call compliance or adherence. And this is you can just find this in the medical literature. They don't hide it. It's called a G-tube or a gastric tube, and they do a surgery. And
the pictures are on the website at LizzBrown.com. Liam, let me ask you a question. Didn't Sean have the right to say, no, I don't want these drugs in my body?
You have any right you want, unless you're an orphan in New York City, unless you're an AIDS patient in the world, then you're right just like the right of anybody, by the way, right now who we consider to be of a certain ethnic group, I don't know, related to the Middle East or something. Your rights can be taken away under certain circumstances for the benefit of the culture or the perceived benefit of the country or the safety of the culture. And AIDS is looked at as an extremely contagious sexually transmitted disease. Again, in the medical literature, it looks like a multifactorial illness, but the perception wins the day. So a little boy who is the child of a drug abuser, whose mother can be, his adoptive mother, his aunt, can be typified as being crazy because she questions the medical literature.
And she took him off the medicine and made him better.
It can be stripped of her rights very, very, very easily and very quickly, and that's exactly what's happened to Mona.
But Mona got her children back, right?
Well, no, Sean is locked up in a hospital in New York City, and it's a psych ward. Now like I said, they're not even worried about the AIDS thing anymore. Now they're keeping him because they want him to take psych drugs. Why? Because he runs away. He runs away from Incarnation Children's Center and other places.
And how old is he now?
15. And by the way, he's tiny. I mean, AZT is a drug that stunts development. He is very, very small, very underdeveloped, and a lot of kids, what are called AZT babies, are small and stunted and underdeveloped.
When we talk about small, we're talking about 4 feet.
Yeah, 4 feet, 1 inch, something like that. He's just breaking 60 pounds at 15 years old.
This type of experimentation wasn't just happening in the United States, it's happening all over the world, isn't it?
Dr. Stephen Nicholas, who established Incarnation Children's Center as an NIH test clinic, runs Columbia University's La Romana, Dominican Republic AIDS centers. And, there are a lot of people trying to do good work for impoverished people there. I think the mistake they make is thinking that AZT is a necessary component of doing that.